Hey everyone, I'm Hashim. Welcome back to another Pushing Film video. With each iteration of Negative Lab Pro, there have been some great improvements. And if you're someone who likes to match your film scans to look closer to scans you're used to getting from a lab, it's becoming easier to do that. But first of all, I want to talk about why would you want to have your home scans match something you're getting from a lab. What I find is that a lot of people enjoy lab scans because those lab scanners tend to add a lot of character to a scan that would otherwise look a little bit more flat on something like a digital camera scan. So they have this certain punchiness and charm and character that a lot of people are quite used to. So they're trying to get their home scans to look a little bit closer to that, whether or not it's exactly the same. And one of the main reasons lab scanners have this certain extra character is because they were designed at a time when they were sending these files straight to their paired printers in order to create prints that would keep customers happy with a really nice baked-in look. Another reason why a lot of people try and match the look of lab scanners is because there's become this maybe trend or something they're used to doing through a hybrid process. Like maybe if you shoot digital alongside film at something like a wedding, which is something I do sometimes, I want all the files to look cohesive. So sometimes you'll be bringing those digital files to look closer to a certain look like maybe the Frontier gives or something like that. So in this video, I want to try and share some of my tips and workflow on how you can bring your scans closer to whatever it is you want them to look like, whether it's a particular lab scanner or the look of your favorite photographer and so on. So the first thing I think it's worth knowing when approaching this subject is that there's a lot of variability within lab scanners. So even if you were getting Frontier scans at one lab and then getting them at another, there's probably going to be a significant difference. A lot of that will depend on the calibration, the person operating the scanner, the monitor they're using, even the lighting in the room. All these little factors will create a lot of variability within the one type of scanner. So it's really worth knowing that there is no certain way a certain film stock is supposed to look. There's no way that Portra 400 is supposed to look. It's all done through interpretation and by design through these bits of hardware and software such as Fujifilm Frontier or Noritsu scanners or Pacon or whatever it is you're used to getting and that you enjoy the look of. All of that is by design. And then even from brand to brand and from scanner to scanner, there's even more variability. There's certain factors that vary between these machines, like whether they're using a linear scanning method or capturing a single frame, or whether it's a CCD sensor, the software it's using, the version, all this sort of stuff makes a big difference. So there is no real way a film scan should look. It's really all about bringing it closer to what you enjoy, whatever it's inspired by. So to demonstrate this, let's look at an identical frame scanned on two different machines that I have loaded up here in Lightroom. One was on a Fujifilm Frontier and one was on the Noritsu. You look at the one on the left being the film frame from the Noritsu machine and on the right from the Frontier. Significant difference. And of course, a lot of this might just be due to operation. Like I said, if you were to bring the white balance closer, for example, of the Frontier one, which is quite cool, you make it a little bit warmer and a bit darker to kind of match that Noritsu one. Sure, it might be a little bit closer, but there's still significant difference. And mind you, they've swapped now. The Frontier one is on the left. But look at the clouds in the Frontier scan, how they have this certain like magenta, pinkish hue. Even though the overall image is cooler, there's more of that warmth in the highlights, whereas the Noritsu has a more neutral highlight. And then even the tone of those gold warm tones of the skin is completely different on the Frontier scan compared to the Noritsu one, which has a different interpretation of those colors, of the skin tones, of even the blues in the jeans and the shadows. So this is really important to realize when you come into this, that there is a lot of variation. And if I was to send this exact same frame to someone with a different Frontier SP3000, I would get a completely different result. And you might be used to getting Noritsu scans that look nothing like this one and more like the Frontier example I'm giving you. So this just further proves that point that there's a lot of variability, but there are sometimes some general tendencies that we can try and work off as we go forward in this video. And just to show you another couple of examples of how drastic this can be, here's another frame that was scanned on both the Frontier and a Noritsu machine. And looking at the one on the left, which is on the Noritsu, the color of these oranges here and the blue of the box that they're in is almost completely different. And then the tonality is different. Things like sharpness, contrast, all that can vary by tendency, but also by operation and setup of the scanners. This is really important to realize. But again, if we're going to look for some of those tendencies, looking at this white paper in the trash can, The Frontier has more of a pinkish hue again. And just to show one last example here, again, the Noritsu one on the left and the Frontier on the right, looking at that orange wall, and on here on the Frontier looks yellow. There is a very different look to some of the colors. And again, the neutral tone of those highlights and those neutrals in the road, for example, are very different on the Frontier. And these are some of the general tendencies that profiles and aspects of Negative Lab Pro try and replicate. And with the newest version, there are even more tools to help you get closer to whatever certain look you're used to or that you want. So with all that being said, I just want to provide you with a few tools to match whatever it is you're after, whether it's really a lab scan or not. But I want it to empower you to match the scans that you're referencing, because your references might be completely different to mine. They might not even really fit these tendencies that I'm talking about. So I'd rather do that than sell you a bunch of presets that I use, because we will be diving into Lightroom as well later in the video to try and bring you even closer if you really want to try and match a lab scan very closely. But I'd rather not do that. I'd rather just give you the understanding and the mechanistic knowledge of what's going on with some of these colors and aspects of scans of your film. So I'll be using the latest version at the time of making this video, which is NLP version 2.3. And I've also got the latest version of Lightroom, the Creative Cloud version, which is called Lightroom Classic. So that, I think, really helps a lot if you have those tools in the later versions of Lightroom to try and play around with some of those hues and saturation and aspects of color. But you'll be fine either way to really get a good starting point. So let's jump into it and start looking at some scans that I've made on NLP, or that I will be doing on NLP, comparing them to the lab scanned versions. And before we proceed too much further, I just want to highlight that sometimes lab scans aren't really the best basis to be replicating unless you're actually happy with them. A lot of the time, lab scans do add that extra character and punch and whatever it might be, but it's often at the cost of detail. So as you can see in this image here with the car, the shadows are very blocked up. There's not much detail in them. There's quite a strong blue cast in the shadows. Sure, it has that vibrance and punchiness, but again, I'm only using these lab scan examples and trying to match them just so you can, again, get that mechanistic understanding. Not that you would necessarily want to replicate this result exactly, but just so you have the power to bring NLP scans closer to what it is you're after. And just to demonstrate that, I'm going to open this up and try and match it to this Frontier scan. And I've got a little bit of a border, so the buffer's set there. And I'm just going to click Convert Negatives. And just to show you how different your base conversion might be to what you're used to getting from a lab. And to be honest with you, what I'm seeing come out from NLP is a result I actually prefer. So there is no real necessity to bring it to that, but it's just to kind of show you that if you really wanted to, you could. And what it would mean is sacrificing a lot of that detail, adding a lot of contrast, and really messing around with those hues to try and bring it closer to what you're seeing, which isn't necessarily always a better scan, but it is something that if you wanted to, you could mess around with, you could do without too much trouble. And then you could go even further in Lightroom to bring it almost exactly to what you're seeing in that result on the left. But let's just cancel that and look at some examples of some nice scans. I wanted to show you at least how to maybe match scans that you're actually quite happy with, or a look that you're used to enjoying from your lab. So for example, this one's not too bad, but it is quite cold. Let's look at this example here, shot on Kodak Portra, scanned on a Fujifilm SP3000. And I've got an NLP digitized, digitized version done with my Canon 5D Mark IV and the Essential film holder. I just need to flip this horizontally, first of all. And then as you would normally do with NLP, if you're not really used to the workflow, I've got a completely different video that you can check out in this card here that has my batch scanning workflow and how I work with all this stuff. But assuming you have a basic understanding, let's go into the reference view, which is going to be quite useful for doing these demonstrations. I've chucked the lab scan in the reference view on the left. Sorry, I got the correct one there now. And now that I've white balanced off the film base, what I will probably do is just crop in a little bit to that frame using a 4:3 ratio. And then we're going to open NLP while in reference view, which is again going to be quite handy. Increase that border buffer a little bit. And again, that's a Frontier scan. So I'm going to leave the Frontier color model on, do Convert Negative, and just to see what we get and how we can maybe bring it closer to that lab scan. All right, so it's converted it now. And what I did like about the lab scan is it does have that really bright, airy pastel look. So the first thing I want to do is probably bring up the exposure or brightness or a little bit of both, just to kind of match that base level of brightness. And then we can go further later on in Lightroom. And one of the great things about the newest version of NLP being version 2.3 is some of these new tools that have been added to actually help you replicate the look you get from the lab. And namely, one of them is this feature called Lab Glow. And if you look at the clouds, for example, in the lab scan, you'll see there's actually a lot more clipped highlights and lost detail in the highlights than there is in my digital camera scan. So if you pay attention to that, you'll notice that is one of the main aspects you'll notice in a lot of lab scans. Mind you, this lab scan of the portrait frame is completely unedited. And looking at the shadows also, the shadows in Sarah's jumper here have a very faded look. It's like the shadows are actually sort of cut off, whereas the shadows here are more detailed. So these great two new tools here, being the Lab Glow and the Fade, will actually help you replicate that kind of loss of detail. So it's a little bit unfortunate that this is what you have to do to kind of bring your results closer to a lab scan, if that is what you're after. But if you want that kind of glowish look, where essentially you're just kind of compressing those highlights a little bit, you can see that as I slide that up, it is bringing it closer to the lab scan. I have to do it a little bit drastically, and I wouldn't go too far personally, but this is again just to show you what's going on. Same with the shadow fade here, the lab fade. So that will actually make a big difference in bringing it closer to the modeling that you're used to seeing from a lot of lab scanners. And the next thing that might be quite different between these two frames is the color modeling. So having these LUTs such as Frontier and Natural and whatnot is a good starting point. But what I would normally do is just start off with Natural and then make the final adjustments in Lightroom, in the actual Lightroom module. If you wanted to, you could play around with the white balance a little bit more here. And again, looking at how the Frontier has those more yellowish leniencies to the midtones, you could kind of play around with that a little bit. But I would generally do all that in Lightroom. So if you were to edit in Lightroom, I always suggest making a positive copy first. I like to use JPEG. And in this case, I'm not going to put it in a folder. I'm just going to stack it, include it in this collection that I'm working out of, and just click make a copy when I do the final application. Before that, what I would also suggest, if you want to get a little bit closer to lab scans, is change it to the lab sharpening, because lab scanners do add a lot of sharpening compared to what you would normally do with a raw scan at home. So I would just do all that and click apply, and then Lightroom will generate a positive version. And what it generally does is it puts it towards the end here. So I'm just going to drag that closer to where I'm working off. So now when I click that positive version, I could work off of that. And this is the point at which I would use the provided Negative Lab Pro color profiles. And you can see as I hover over them, they have some really powerful ability to kind of already bring it quite close. Looking at the crystal archive paper simulation, you could slide that in and out if you wanted a really quick and easy result that brings it a little bit closer to what you're expecting from a lab. Or you could go with something like the actual Frontier LUT, which if you notice those skin tones, it does bring it closer to the skin tones you're expecting to see. And then I would also maybe slide that around, play with it to bring it to the level I want. And then one final thing you'll notice is that there is still a bit more of a soft and dreamy look in the lab scan. So you could always do something like the dehaze in a negative direction. And also what I would suggest is exchanging a little bit of saturation for vibrance, because the lab scans do tend to have this strong vibrance. I would go positive on the vibrance, a little bit negative on saturation. And one of the last things you need to do is match those strong color shifts that I mentioned when showing you those Noritsu and Frontier comparisons. And the way to do that is you want to go down to your HSL panel. And this is worth remembering because you're going to probably notice a tendency if you want to bring closer to those lab scans is your warm tones when it comes to hue will shift, especially if you're looking at a Frontier scan, they'll shift more towards the right side. So you could even just do a general adjustment towards the right with those warm tones to bring it a little bit closer. I'll probably bring up the overall warmth a little bit, especially when it comes to magenta. Maybe a little bit of both. And if you look at those skin tones, there's just certain colors that need to be shifted around to match that. And then the greens look to be a little bit more towards yellow as well. So again, just making these simple adjustments has brought it a lot closer. And one of the last things you'll notice is the blues don't have a very natural look on the frontier especially. So you bring that aqua slider down towards the green side. And again, this is something I actually really enjoy doing because I don't really like the look of the skies looking too kind of teal there. That if you really wanted to match it, you can see that, you know, compared to the default result, that has brought it a little bit closer to that lab scan. And doing all of that wasn't too hard. So that's pretty much the basis of how you can use the tools on a really simple level. Definitely feel free to stick around for the rest of the video if you want to see me get a little bit more in depth with a bunch of different scans. I've tried to choose, you know, Fuji 400H frames and Portra and even Ektar and a few different examples if you really want to kind of learn the ins and outs of how Lightroom and NLP 2.3 can work really well together to bring your scans more to where you want them. It's a long video, but I've tried to put chapter markers in, so feel free to skip ahead to whatever frames you're interested in. And I'm sure that you'll probably learn a couple of things about how all this works as we go forward. All right, so going back to the grid, let's look at another example, maybe something from a Noritsu scanner. I've got a 35mm frame here, but I've got this is from a Noritsu scan here, which is from a wedding. So I know a lot of you wedding photographers might be interested in replicating the look of these lab scanners. It is quite nice. It is something that you can get using NLP if you really want to. So I've got the digitized frame here. And again, first things first, we're just going to white balance the film from the clear part there. And just for my help, I'm going to put the film scan from the lab as a reference here before opening NLP and doing the conversion. Obviously, you wouldn't normally be doing this. You might be working off a different reference photo, but you can always do that too if you really want to. So a little bit of a border, I'm going to leave that. And this time the color model is on Noritsu, as I would want it to be trying to match a Noritsu scan. I'm going to click Convert Negative, wait for that to work, and see what we get. All right, so straight off the bat, there's a situation where the NLP scan has a very different look, and it's really not too ideal. But again, you have the power to mess around with this, to change it, to get it closer to what you want. So everything's on default here. And what I tend to do is leave it on lab standard if you're trying to match lab scans. But sometimes the lab scans you might get will look a little bit softer. So feel free to change it to lab soft, for example, because you can always add that contrast back later on. But do learn the difference between some of these tone profiles as you're getting used to NLP, because I think they can really provide a lot of power. But the first things first here is that the white balance looks completely different from the Noritsu scan. So let's play with some of the different options like auto cool, or maybe because it's Fuji Pro 400H, let's use the Fuji profile. And straight away, that Fuji profile looks a lot better as a starting point. So let's just work with that. And then what I'm going to do again is raise the exposure, because I've overexposed this film and I have given it a really bright sort of airy look, or at least the person scanning on the Noritsu maintain that. So we're going to just raise that exposure again to try and match what we're seeing on the scan on the left. We've got the Fuji white balance model, but it still looks a little bit too pink. So I'm just going to drop that a little bit and then maybe warm up that part of the white balance there, and maybe play a little bit with that contrast, reducing it further. Or maybe what we'll do actually instead of that is, again, use those great lab glow and fade tools. So looking at the highlights, again, there's a little bit less detail in the highlights in the lab scan. So I want to try and match that, especially if you look at the dress and the veil, not as much as previously. And maybe the lab fade, looking at the groom's hair, you can see a little bit of that fade in the shadows, which we want to try and replicate to some degree at least, just as a starting point. All right, so that's brought our starting point a little bit closer. You could mess around a little bit more, but I'll probably do that in Lightroom. But I'll again change the LUT to natural as a starting point, and then I would apply the frontier LUT in Lightroom, because natural is a better starting point if you're going to bake that in. I'd rather bake that in than the frontier look from the get-go. So let us just make a copy as a positive again, change it to lab sharpening, apply that, and generate a positive copy. So once again, Lightroom's made a positive copy. I'm just going to bring it a little bit closer, switch over to that. And then now, starting from the top, go to those color profiles and look at what the Frontier profile does to those skin tones and to the highlights and the general warmth. The Frontier does generally have a sort of a golden look. So let's just apply that first. And then tweak that white balance a little bit more, just trying to bring it closer. And then maybe I probably could have gone a bit too far in that lab fade, but I can undo a little bit of that just here with my tone curve. And that's already brought it quite close to what I'm seeing on the Noritsu scan. But if you wanted to, again, bring it really close, what you want to dive into is those HSL panels. And you can do it manually, as I said there, just kind of sliding the hues closer to what you're used to seeing. Now, the Noritsu doesn't add as much of that yellowishness to the skin tones. It has more of a peachy look. So if you wanted to, you could also use this great tool that you can drag over certain parts of the photo. So you can put it over skin, for example, and just drag that until you kind of match what you're seeing in the lab version or whatever it is that you're aiming for. And again, you can see quite a difference in the color of the jacket there. So I could play around with that, do the same for saturation, do the same for luminance, for example. Skin might not be as luminous as the lab scan. So you really have a lot of power when you're using something like Lightroom and NLP. So to be honest, you could go further, but I'll just leave that there because I think that's done a pretty good job, especially compared to what the NLP was giving me initially. So let's just jump back to the grid and look at another frame. So let's say you did have a 35mm frame such as this one. And again, there is that tendency for lab scanners to sacrifice a lot of the detail and give you a result that might not necessarily be optimal, but you do enjoy the colors that you get. So if you were to take the matching DSLR scan here and convert it in NLP, let's just see what we get with this one. So I might just crop it in a little bit more just to get rid of some of that unnecessary level of border. We can leave a little bit in. Then go back to our reference view, put the lab scan as reference, flip it horizontally because I haven't done that yet. Open up NLP, put it on a Frontier color model because it is a Frontier scan we're looking at, and just click Convert Negative. So as you can see, once again, the NLP scan has brought up a lot more detail in the shadows. It's a lot flatter and cleaner, but you can bring it a little bit closer. And this one seems to have retained some details from my last conversion, but I can reset that because I didn't really go too far on it. But what you can see again with the Frontier scan is the look of the warm tones. The Frontier has this really golden look to it, especially the way those neutrals have rendered. There's this strong pinkish hue in the highlights. You can see that those highlights are rather clipped in the lab scan compared to the digital camera scan. But again, if you wanted to replicate that, just drag that lab glow. Before we do that, I think the main difference we're seeing here is a lot of difference in contrast and brightness. So I'm actually going to bring the exposure and brightness down. The density in the lab scan probably wasn't ideal. I think it's a little bit dark, especially considering it was exposed for the interior. If you really wanted to, you could do that. You could really harden the contrast, maybe even go with a lab hard as a starting point, and then add even more contrast to that. So you can see that's all it's really needed to bring it fairly close. One other thing is the white balance. It looks, auto neutral's done a pretty good job, but I might just warm it up a little bit to bring it closer to that Frontier scan. You can already see it's getting a lot closer. And now we can play with that lab glow to unfortunately destroy some of those highlights. Bring the black points down a lot because the darks are really crunchy in the lab scan. So we want to try and replicate that. So again, yeah, I wouldn't really recommend doing this personally, but if it's what you want, if it's what you're going for, feel free. So that's pretty close. I mean, again, I would just change it to natural here, apply the lab sharpening, make a copy, grab that positive once it generates, and see how close it is to the look of the lab scan. So let's just select the positive. It's still not exactly there, but let's select the Frontier color profile. As we hover over it, you can see it's adding a bit of that pinkishness to the highlights, which is what we want. So that's a good starting point. And again, there's a big difference in detail. You still have a lot more highlight detail in the DSLR scan despite having used that lab glow. But if you really wanted to get destructive, you could get rid of a little bit more of that. But we probably won't bother going that far with things. I'll just try and bring it a little bit close. But yeah, the main thing you want to do is, again, go to that HSL panel and just play with the hue. Just bring things closer. So any obvious colors, like you got those blues there, you want to shift them more towards what the Frontier tends to do. So again, the tendency is you bring those warm tones to the right, and you bring the cool tones, conversely, to the left. This is the tendency for what Frontier scanners will do. And then the green tones tend to shift a little bit towards blue oftentimes, but that already brings it a little bit closer. If you wanted to get in depth, you could add more of that magenta into the highlights that I've mentioned. So you just go to your highlight panel there, you find magenta, you play around with the saturation, see how much you need, or however much you want really. And then oftentimes shadows will be a little bit cool on the other hand. So I could add a little bit of blue to the shadows. And then again, you can still see there's a lot more clean shadow detail in the DSLR scan. So if you want to destroy some of that, you could bring the shadow luminance down. And you can see I've gotten pretty close to that lab scan already compared to what we had before. So you could go further, but again, this is just to show you what is actually happening in these scans to bring them to that level. And to be honest, you really have to get rid of a lot of detail sometimes to match these lab scans. And I wouldn't really want to go this far personally, but if you wanted to, the power is all there in Lightroom, as you can see. All right, so you should be getting a pretty good idea of what's going on by now, and hopefully feel like you have a little bit more knowledge of how to bring your NLP scans closer to any certain result. There is a lot of power in there, and it's good to understand how some of these tools work. So let's just take a look at maybe 1 or 2 more frames and see what else we can do with some of these scans. So maybe let's look at this one here, which is actually a frame of Kodak Ektar 100 on the Pentax 645N. As you can see, scanned on the Fujifilm SP3000. And as mentioned, the Frontier does give these really vibrant, punchy results. It's not just because it's the Kodak Ektar film, but a lot of it is in part due to the fact, or due to the way that the Frontier handles those specific scans. So let's digitize or convert, this one. I'm just going to white balance it first. Bring up my lab scan as a reference. Open up NLP, and we're going to leave it on Frontier, normal pre-saturation, add a little bit of border buffer to account for that border I've left. And I'm going to click convert negative. Let's see how close this one gets. I haven't actually looked at this before. All right, so it's not too far, but it is different. So that's with all the default settings. That's with lab standard. So in terms of contrast, lab standard is doing a good job matching the lab look. I mean, just to demonstrate though, you can see that if you were to do a linear gamma, or sorry, let's go with linear. There's a lot more detail there that would normally come up if you weren't trying to simulate the lab look, but let's just stick with that. And first of all, bring down the exposure a little bit, because I think it's looking a bit bright. So auto neutral has done a pretty good job as a starting point, but what I would do is just sort of play with what it's given me and bring those skin tones closer towards the yellow look, which is what the lab scan, again, being a Frontier, it does favor those yellow golden hues. And then remove even more of that pink to bring it towards green. Again, we can tweak this further in Lightroom, but even that's just giving me a good starting point already. So what I would do also is maybe reduce some of that contrast, or actually leave it, that looks fine. Maybe add a little bit of lab fade. Again, looking at the shadow detail, it is a little bit faded in the lab. So again, these great new tools in version 2.3 can help you do that. The lab scan's giving me a lot less shadow detail in general. So I would darken the shadows, not too much, just a little bit there. And maybe play with that lab glow a little bit to give a little bit of glow to the highlights, even though in this case, it's not as necessary. So I wouldn't go too far on that. But as a starting point in NLP, I think this is not bad. I would still have to do a fair bit in Lightroom to bring it closer. Just with a couple of minor adjustments, I'm going to change it to the natural profile being the better starting point to bake in. As mentioned, make a copy, put it on lab sharpening, and just apply that. So I want to grab my positive version and work off of that and see how we can bring it closer to the frontier look. So first things, as done previously, let's hover over that frontier color profile, and you can see it's definitely adding more warmth to the highlights and shifting those blues a little bit, which is what we want. So I'm going to click that, maybe reduce its application. And first things, go down to that HSL panel, try and replicate some of those hue shifts that the frontier has given me. So the color of the denim, to be honest, is a lot more natural in the NLP result, but if we wanted to replicate some of the look and hue of the frontier, it's not too hard to do just by reducing the luminance and giving it a bit of a shift and saturating those blues a little bit more. And as I mentioned in one of those earlier frames, what you want to do to replicate lab scans is often exchange saturation for vibrance. So removing some saturation and adding a roughly equal amount of vibrance will bring you a little bit closer. So just comparing before and after. So there's an overall slightly cooler tone in the lab scan. I'm just going to try and bring things a little bit closer using that first. But maybe we'll continue a little bit further with the HSL panel. So again, we follow that general trend to move the warm tones off to the right. You can see again the reds get a little bit closer if we give it positive. The skin tones lean more yellow on frontier scans. And as we shift, especially the yellows, you can see that that background gravel does start to look more like the lab scan. And you could play with the greens. What I tend to find is that the saturation of greens is often dropped to match lab scans, and even the luminance a little bit. So again, you could tweak around, you could play with all this as much as you wanted to, and really try and get as close as you want. But straight from the get-go here, you can see it's looking a lot closer to what we're seeing. One thing that might still be a little bit different is those blues, so you could play around with that and really kind of tweak it around to get a little bit more exacting, but that's really up to you. As you can see, that's already made a significant difference. Personally, I prefer the way the colors were rendering in the default NLP scan, but just with some of those minor tweaks, sorry, you can see it's brought it a lot closer. So that's another good example of a completely different film stock doing its thing. So, all right, one of the last things I want to show you is sometimes when NLP doesn't give you a very good starting point, or when you have tricky scans that you're working with. And this can often come up when you're dealing with images that have heavy neutral areas, like a road, for example. If you have a big area of road or pathway, or these gray tones that you would get in those kind of images, this is where you sometimes will encounter difficulty. So let's look at this scan. This is a really nice lab scan. It's on a Fujifilm Frontier, again, SP500. My result with the NLP conversion was generally quite different. So just to show you that, I've already white balanced this one previously, but let's convert this to show you how different, because there is that heavy area of road. I think this sometimes can throw NLP off. So let's do a reference conversion again and show you how NLP deals with this frame in comparison. So let's turn off the border buffer, since this time I haven't left the border. Put on 0, convert negatives, and see what we get. So looking at those neutrals, the roads that are quite a flat sort of, dark gray color, they've given me this really unusual red tone in the NLP conversion. If you've ever encountered this, keep in mind it could be due to the fact that the road areas are often throwing off the scan for whatever reason. I haven't figured out if it's just my camera, the way I'm digitizing frames, but it is a slight tendency that I have noticed. And one of the ways to quickly counter that, let's assume that your overall white balance besides that area is looking okay. And in this case, auto neutral is looking okay. I think it's a little bit closer to auto cool. So maybe somewhere in between the two would look better. So let's start with cool and warm that back up. But you can see that red tone starts to creep in to the shadows. So as with previously, the lab scan's giving us less dynamic range. It's really adding contrast. So if I drop those darks, first of all, but I also want to remove that red from them. So if I go down to the color module here and go to the shadows, I want to move away from red towards cyan. Now you can see it's already fixed it a fair bit. I also want to move away from magenta and towards green to replicate the more neutral look I'm seeing in the frontier scan there. So this is all in the shadows. And you can see a little bit more yellow also. So just by playing with these sliders, I can very quickly and very easily replicate some of that look. Now, in terms of the shadow detail, it's a lot smoother and more matte and faded in the lab scan once again. So this is where that lab fade tool will come in really handy. Just cranking that up replicates a bit of that lab look. And that's already brought it a lot closer. So I think at this point, I would just start working in Lightroom. You could do a little bit more in NLP, but all I'm going to do is change it to lab sharpening as with previously, make a positive copy and apply that. But yeah, most of the work's going to be in the HSL panel. And one of the biggest glaring differences is the sky. I do enjoy the way the sky looks in the lab scan. So if we wanted to replicate that, in this case, the hue isn't much of the problem. It's more the saturation and luminance. So we're going to desaturate that blue sky a little bit. Overall brightness might be lower. And to be honest, I'd be pretty happy with that. If you really wanted to do those other adjustments as with the first ones, you could play a bit more with those greens. And in this case, they're actually leaning a little bit more yellow and mess around with all that. Further reduce the shadow detail to add contrast or remove it, add it, whatever it is you really want to do. So yeah, this is already looking a lot closer to what we're seeing from the lab scan. One thing you could do, again, because I can still see that warm glow in the Frontier version, is do what we did before and add a bit of magenta to the highlights, just until it comes a little bit closer. But then you could even go into the midtones and add that warm glow, just by finding the hue of it. So you can go exaggerated to start off with, just to find out where those neutrals are leaning, kind of towards a yellow gold color, and then back off a little bit on the saturation until you're happy with it. And then you could even play with the overall luminance of those midtones. So that's just one little difficulty I wanted to highlight and how to overcome that when you have those images with roads. And I had a couple more examples to kind of show you how that would have worked. But to be honest, it would be more of the same. So I don't want to have this video go on for much longer than it's already going. I think you get the idea. It is really important that you're starting with a good digitization of the frame first of all the aspects like the LED light you're using, the diffuser, what kind of film holder, how far you are from the frame, what camera you're using, the sensor, the resolution, the lens especially makes a lot of difference. So keep in mind that, as mentioned in the beginning, your results will vary a lot. So if you're struggling with any particular issue, I would really suggest going back and looking at my batch scanning with NLP workflow. Even though that was the previous version of NLP, the workflow is the same. So you can head back and check that video out. But if you're working with good digitizations of your frames, a lot of the stuff covered in this video should help you bring the most out of these tools in the new version of NLP. But if you have any specific questions, feel free to ask me, drop them in the comments, send the frames you're struggling with on Discord. I'd be happy to even do a live stream going further into some of these examples. So I hope some of this was helpful. Let me know if it was and what you think of the new version of Negative Lab Pro. I'm really liking it. There's a lot more than just these tools that I've gone over. I think it's a significant improvement upon the last version. Every time they do an update, there are some nice little improvements. I think it's the best software around for converting negatives. So I've continued to have been using it for years now. And if you're interested in trying NLP, I do have a link in the description of this video to the free trial. And then if you do sign up using that trial, it is an affiliate type link. So I would get a small commission if you choose to sign up using that one. But either way, you can still do the free trial, mess around with NLP version 2.3 yourself. So thanks for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.